In the endgame of Conquest or Zero Strength and Magic, we are up against our most significant challenge to date, which is defeating Takumi. This is one of the most difficult final maps in the entire Fire Emblem franchise, and even in normal playthroughs, most players can only get by using some sort of cheat strategy. On Lunatic difficulty, this is typically done by using the rescue staff to move a single unit to the boss to defeat him in one turn, and nearly all of my other Conquest playthroughs have used this method. I currently have all the tools needed to reach Takumi with the rescue strategy, but because all my units have Zero Strength and Magic, none of my units can defeat him in one round, which ruins everything. If you can't defeat Takumi in one round, then you will most invariably die on enemy phase, as all the surrounding enemies pile on you. Takumi is incredibly tanky, boasting 75 HP and the Dragon Skin skill, which halves all damage taken and further reduces bonus damage from skills and critical hits. Technically, it could be possible for me to defeat him in one round, even with 0 strength, if I get extremely lucky with critical hits and percent activation skills. The best bet for doing this would be to pile as many damage buffs as possible onto Korin, whose Shadow Yato can mitigate some of Dragon Skin's damage reduction effects. But even this low probability one round strategy has a minimum damage threshold to meet, and unfortunately, my current Korin build just not good enough to get this to work with any amount of reliability. Too many of my resources were tied up in other units that I needed to even get to this point in the run, and a considerable amount was also wasted on ideas that didn't really go anywhere. If I optimized the run from the start with perfect knowledge of how things would go, I could probably make Korin strong enough to one round Takumi semi-reliably, but for the most part, I've just been winging it as I go along, and redoing things really isn't an option. So frankly, at this point, Korin is not strong enough to defeat Takumi, making the rescue skip strategy a non-starter, which leaves very few options for completing the map, one of which is shockingly playing the map normally as originally intended by the developers. This is a ridiculous idea for many reasons, but at this point, it's the best option I have. In order to do this, I'll need to fight through an entire map filled with the strongest enemies in the game. Because of the unprecedented level of difficulty on this map, I did something I normally don't do, which is practice the map off stream before I try it live, and I found that this was definitely a good idea because it took nearly 20 hours of attempts and brainstorming to come up with a general plan that was even remotely workable. Let me begin by discussing strategies that were not at all viable because most of them weren't. My usual go-to strategy, which is turtling in the starting area, will not work because of a couple of reasons. Handling the first few batches of enemies is doable, but the reinforcement waves will soon become extremely overwhelming, making it impossible to push through the map while also dealing with the reinforcements. Since there are an infinite number of reinforcements on this map, you can't just wait them out. This causes map progress to come to a standstill, which is really bad because of the main map mechanic, where Takumi launches AoE attacks every other turn, dealing half max HP damage to all of your units. And these AoE attacks are even more effective against me, because replicated units have shared HP pools, so they'll be hit twice for half max HP, reducing them to 1. This can be defended against by using Dragon Veins to block the AoE attacks, but there are a limited number of them, so if you stay still, you'll eventually run out of them and be wiped out. There are also many enemy staff users with infinite use enfeeble staffs and inevitable end, causing stacking debuffs, which will further weaken my army as the battle drags on. Any battle of attrition is clearly not in my favor. In other words, I have to advance as far as possible, as quickly as possible, which is a lot to ask when all my units have 0 strength and 0 magic. After I work out a general rough plan, I execute it for the first time live on stream. My first priority is to get rid of status abusers as quickly as possible. On turn 1, I immediately move Mozu down to enemy range, saying for her to immediately snipe an enfeeble maid, and then I use one of my 4 precious rescue staff chargers to move her to safety. I shelter a Zerd to get her out of range and move all my units down, finishing my turn by having all my replicate units create their replicates, increasing my unit count from the normal maximum of 16 to 22. Since I'm not going for the rescue skip, I can afford to use my rescue charges offensively to snipe priority targets. On enemy phase, a squad of Oni chieftains move in, aided by Jacob, who is able to easily survive their attacks. This begins my second turn, and I quickly move to counter. The Oni chieftains are tanky, but luckily they have moved in a pretty packed formation, allowing me to savage blow them into submission. If they moved in separately, I would have a much harder time. Reinforcements also attack from the sides, heroes from the left and Onryoji from the right. Reinforcers are really hard to deal with on this map because they spawn on dark waters terrain, which is completely inaccessible to player units, even flyers. This means that these reinforcements are extremely difficult to intercept before they're ranged to attack. This doesn't give you many good options. You can either risk taking hits from incredibly strong enemies or wait until they move off the dark waters terrain. Taking hits unfortunately can risk death, while waiting is also not an option because being delayed even for a single turn can have significant consequences. So I take a third option, which is exclusively available from 3 range. This is why I went through a tremendous amount of trouble to get the Spy Shuriken in Chapter 27. Some of these reinforcers are too far away to attack on this turn with conventional 1-2 range weaponry, but with the 3 range Spy Shuriken, you can attack them. The Spy Shuriken itself doesn't do much damage because the might is low and I have 0 strength, but it does allow you to activate pair-up attacks from increased range, and Mozu does enough damage with the Crescent Bow that her pair-up attacks are enough to significantly damage the faraway on Miyoji, and I'm lucky enough to defeat him with a critical hit. This allows him to move faster and clean up the reinforcement waves on the right, but I kinda mess up against the heroes on the left. And even worse, while I did set up protective walls to defend against Takumi's AoE, they don't protect units on left and rightmost columns, causing several units to be clocked for half their HP, resulting in the death of a replicate mechanist, which also causes his copy to die. This is pretty bad. It's already turn 2 and I've already lost 2 units. In any of my practice attempts, this will be sufficient cause to just restart, but since this was my first live attempt on stream, I just decided to go with it and try to get as far as I could. The next main challenge is a wall of 4 status staff maids and an overwhelming mix of generals, master ninjas, paladins, and malignites. I already managed to snipe one of the maids on turn 1, leaving only 3 left. On turn 3 of player phase, I cleaned up the remaining reinforcements from the previous turn and immediately moved to assassinate one of the maids. I moved Mozu down to kill one and then immediately burned a second rescue use to retreat and dance to kill a third maid, leaving only 1 left, after which I burned my third rescue to get back to safety. Having stripped the wall of status staff support, I moved to bait them to fight them on my own terms, but this is difficult to do safely and quickly, and I cannot afford to wait. Even worse, these enemies move in 2 separate groups which must be baited separately, increasing potential casualties. I use a mechanist to bait on the left and Yamato on the right. The mechanist is killed by a general and dies in the process, taking his copy with him, and Yamato gets piled by 3 enemies and dies. I begin turn 4 having already lost 5 units and immediately capitalize on these sacrifices to push even further towards Takumi, who looms ever closer. I have Mozu one-shot a tanky paladin with the Crescent Bow and then dance to do it again. I then take out the malignites by having my mechanist use bows with effective Mozu pair-up damage. I then have a generic maid I capture in Chapter 27 use the S-rank staff Bifrost to immediately revive Yamato, bring him back to life and give me back one of my strongest units. Unfortunately, because of my mounting casualties, I'm unable to wipe out the enemy forces and the generals prove too tanky to kill. Moreover, because of the stress of playing this live and having a lot of things go wrong, I straight up forget to guard against Takumi's AoE attack, and he launches a devastating energy wave that halves my entire army's HP, a potentially game-ending mistake. In the ensuing chaos, Azura is immediately killed as well as Kazik and Midori and their associated copies, losing me 5 units in 1 turn, bringing me down to 13 units out of the original 22. Again, in any practice run, this will be a sign to just give up, but since this is my first live attempt, I decided to keep going. Things aren't looking good as I start turn 5 with 9 casualties, which is made worse by the fact that the deadly reinforcements I was so worried about start appearing. 4 faces appear from the top, and 8 cavalry organized into 4 pairs enter from the bottom. These 8 cavalry are so tanky that it's nearly impossible for me to fight them cleanly even at full strength, and I'm not currently anywhere near full strength. But on the bright side, this attempt was already so scuffed that it gave me a boldness to experiment and try extremely risky strategies that I would never normally consider even in practice. At this point, we have already wildly diverged from any preparation I've done, and my mindset was one where I assumed I was already going to lose. It gets to the point where as I start the turn, I attack with Yamato, who I just revived, and he dies immediately to a critical hit, but I clicked so fast that the sound didn't play, so I didn't quite register that I got crit, and I wasn't even mad that it happened because I just assumed I made a mistake. At this point, I entered a zen state of desperation, or perhaps a Scuff Nirvana. Things were so bad that I no longer felt influenced by the potential of future catastrophe, allowing me to identify a critical opening. After using 3 out of my 4 rescue charges to assassinate and enfeeble maids, I only have 1 rescue charge left. So I decided to make a Hail Mary play and try to move as many units to Takumi as possible in an effort to assassinate him before all my units die. Defeating Takumi with only 1 unit is not possible, but if I were to sacrifice my entire army to get 3 or 4 units in a position, there is hope. So I start turn 5 by healing Korin and then pair Gunter up with her. I immediately use rescue to teleport Korin to get into attack range of Takumi. Unfortunately, I'm not anywhere near defeating him in 1 round, even with lucky skill and critical activations, so I'll have to do this over multiple turns. Fortunately, my efforts in attacking from the front have paid off because Takumi is now quite isolated. Rescue skip kills must be done in 1 turn, or otherwise units in previous lines of defense can move back to assist, but I've already dealt with them, albeit with significant casualties. And this leaves Takumi with surprisingly few defenders. The 3 great masses near him don't move, so they aren't an immediate threat. So this only leaves the 4 pairs of cavalry that just entered the field. If I can block them, I can buy time for Korin to have multiple solo rounds of combat with Takumi, which at this point is my only path to victory. And so I use all my remaining units to body block these 4 cavaliers, preventing them from assisting in Korin and Takumi's duel. The 4 pairs of cavaliers move in to clean up my army, and I almost immediately lose one of my Savage Roll mechanists, taking his copy with him, and Mozu managed to tank one hit with shield gauge before being killed by another attack. The remaining foes move upward, attacking my straggling units, killing a maid and rallyman, but luckily moving them away from Korin. All 3 of the Great Masters waste their status stabs on Jacob instead of Korin, leaving Korin in tip-top condition to fight Takumi, who almost always moves last in enemy phase turn order. Takumi attacks Korin, activating Vengeance for 0 bonus damage, and Korin counters with a Dragon Fang and a normal attack, barely managing taking out half his HP. Takumi doesn't have passive healing, the only nearby healer was distracted by Jacob, allowing this damage to stick. I begin turn 6 with only 7 units remaining and Takumi on half HP, giving me a tremendous number of actions to finish the job, but it might not be enough. Korin is the only one that can do any damage, and she's been debuffed by Takumi's Draconic Hex, reducing her speed to the point where she can no longer double. Not to mention, Takumi's shield gauge has built up, which will further reduce my damage output. Just as a side note, Poison Strike and Savage Bow will not work here, because Takumi's Dragon Skin skill completely nullifies out of combat damage. I start by moving in a generic Falconite to transfer away Gunter and use an Enfeeble Staff in the hopes of lowering Takumi's speed so Korin can double, but it misses, which is not good because I really needed that extra damage. At this point, I'm confident that things had never been more over, but I refuse to go down without a fight. I move Camilla to transfer Gunter over to hit Takumi to increase his shield gauge. Afterwards, Gunter immediately dies. Then I move Jacob to transfer himself over to Korin and attack with Camilla to peel off Takumi's shield gauge, but this also causes Camilla and her replicate to die. I also get an unexpected pair-up attack, which unexpectedly also builds Takumi's shield gauge. Now with the Jacob pair-up, Korin can double again, so I attack with Korin, getting a Dragon Fang on the first strike, but Takumi counters with Vengeance, which I luckily dodge. His own pair-up attack gets blocked, but I also builds a shield gauge, which surprisingly blocks my second hit. It seems my extra pair-up attack when I attack with Camilla has unexpectedly given him enough shield gauge to block my attacks. Things are extremely over at this point because Takumi can heal for half his HP by killing a unit on enemy phase with Life Taker, and if he heals at this point, I simply cannot win. Death looms over me as his AoE energy wave drains the last bit of HP from my remaining units, but suddenly, a miracle occurs. Arthur dies blocking from the Dark Knights, and a quirk of the turn order works out to my benefit. Before Takumi can kill the Falcon Knight to heal himself, an enemy Bone Knight moves in first, because Takumi will always move near the end of enemy phase. This prevents Takumi from killing the Falcon Knight and self-healing and forces him to attack Korin. Korin blocks the attack with shield gauge and counter-attacks, landing a normal hit that a Dragon Fang, bringing Takumi down to 1 HP. Korin gets hit by an Enfeeble multiple times, but all the remaining enemies are out of position and are too far away to assist. I begin my final player phase on turn 7 with only 2 units remaining, Korin and Jacob. Takumi is left at exactly 1 HP and is only 1 attack away from activating shield gauge, giving me just exactly enough to kill him. I attack with Korin with 100% accuracy, defeating Takumi and completing the endgame of Fire Emblem Fate's Conquest with 0 strength and magic in my first live attempt with one of the narrowest margins of victory I've ever had in any of my playthroughs.